and I a kind of a center around wanting to do all I can in Portland to help especially improve the lives of East Portlanders, but all Portlanders, Oregonians, and beyond. That there's kind of like maybe 40 years of lack of services, I would say, to the kind of folks that I grew up with in East Portland. So that was kind of the beginning of a political awakening. I said, hey, I want all Portlanders to have access to the same services. And went to Franklin High School, had a brother that went to Grant High School. Hey guys, go Generals. And that kind of put me on, essentially growing up in East Portland and seeing kind of how just different, where you were born, based on where you're born, you got different access to opportunities. That put me on a path where I've had a little bit of anger, and I tried to figure out how do I constructively use this anger. And I found that electoral politics was a great way for someone who in high school maybe was like a little bit of a rabble rouser, maybe had some excess energy, but in electoral politics, you can hone that in. And if you do a good job and follow the established rules, instead of going to the principal's office, you get to change who holds elected office and makes policy for tens of thousands, if not millions of people for future generations. And so I did that for about a decade in the state legislature, in the state Senate, and then also in the mayor's office. The mayor's office in City Hall was particularly challenging. And I didn't quite realize how kind of beat up I was within, kind of out of alignment with my own values and my own excitement until a single evening with what is now an FDA scheduled as a breakthrough therapy called psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in certain types of fungi that grows around the planet and has run around the planet for at least several billion years. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about, this obscure compound in mushrooms that has this really remarkable potential and a class of plants and fungi like that when used responsibly with care and intention. And so as I was exiting City Hall in the mayor's office, I heard about these couple of therapists that ran a group circle for specifically for men who are recovering from themselves being abusers. So often cases of domestic violence, very, very thorny therapy work, trying to help dudes in particular do some healing and some forgiveness of themselves, some reconciliation, potentially people they harmed. And they were, these two therapists were doing this work for years and had recently decided, you know what, we'd like to add more tools to the toolbox here. What about this class of compound in this mushroom that, as of now, 51 years ago, were scheduled by President Nixon and team because of, well, we won't get into why it all got scheduled, but it became illegal. And so here we are now 51 years later trying to make them unillegal. And that was Tom and Cherie's kind of vision, is how do we do this? And so I heard through the grapevine, through the political circles, that they were working on this. There was nothing of its kind. It seems like it's in the headlines everywhere at this point. But at that time, there was no work nationally and worldwide to create policy to try to bring these classes of medicines or plants or fungi back into a regulated medical model, a healthcare model. So I tracked down Cherie's number and got coffee with Tom and Cherie and introduced them to some folks in City Hall to see how we can help with their effort. But we quickly realized this is really a statewide effort. And this is about getting other people to buy into this vision, to potentially shed some assumptions through very well documented, untrue propaganda that the federal government had put out for at least 45 years at that point. And it's more about getting to kind of believe that these things can be used responsibly. And if we could do that and we could do some fundraising, then maybe we'll be able to create a ballot measure and give Oregonians a chance to vote on this. Is it time to bring these things into healthcare, into a regulated model? So I worked with them for a few years on that, and we created what became ballot measure 109. Really a child of Tom and Cherie's. They considered it to be their kid because they could not have kids. And eventually that kid was raised by a village and passed by 1.2 million Oregonians. And here we are now in what people call a psychedelic renaissance. Psychedelic is a Latin word that broadly means to heal within. to heal what is inside. And Veterans Day is almost here. Both my parents are veterans. We work with a lot of veterans groups. And there has been no group of people that we've worked more closely with in the broader psychedelic community to heal within veterans in particular. And it's veterans and their work and their healing and their testimonials to Congress that have led to this kind of resurgence of bringing these things, once outlawed, back into a legal paradigm. And it's why we have MDMA, what some people may call ecstasy, an extremely powerful medicine, a beautiful medicine that has been abused in some cases or used without intention, and it earned the nickname ecstasy. And I'm sure when I say that word, all these ideas, if you know what that is, kind of come up about it. But really, when used in a responsible framework with a trained professional, it can unleash profound healing, profound, I almost get kind of like tearful thinking about it, because working with veterans in particular, among others who have endured very, very painful experiences from childhood or through adulthood, you see in sometimes a single session, but not always, just this relinquishing of the anger, of the anger at oneself or others. And once there's that kind of relinquishing and kind of realignment with kind of the inner child, that like this, the love that we once had before we were potentially tormented, then all this other healing can come about, including kind of beginning to reconcile when we have maybe hurt others or not been nice to our friends or family. So it's veterans that have kind of brought us to this point where we have breakthrough therapy for MDMA, for psilocybin, for ketamine, and all these other additional medicines, some synthetic, some that grow right out of the ground. What Oregon created, thanks for enduring my slightly meandering remarks, but with the Oregon model, we created something that didn't exist. Either there was illegal use, what we call underground, of these compounds, or you would go to pretty much the exact opposite, which is the FDA pathway. So the most rigorous pathway that you have to be diagnosed for, that most people don't have access to, and that can be quite expensive, even with insurance. The Oregon model, what Tom and Cherie envisioned, was a middle of the road, a medicalized, regulated model, but one where you didn't have to have a diagnosis, and we could train people through a government licensed training program, which is something Tom and I are currently running. It's the first Oregon, or the first government licensed school in the world to train eventually state licensed practitioners who will specifically work with psilocybin to work with anybody, veterans. Damian Lillard lost his passion for basketball and wants to get back into alignment. He would be eligible. So the goal is to create this model that isn't so difficult to access to the FDA, but is not what most people experience still to this day, which is completely unregulated, where you don't have any licenses, you don't have a medical board where you could say, hey, someone's maybe acting unethical, or they're exploiting people, they're charging too much. And so we're on the precipice of essentially a new model of healthcare, what Tom and Cherie called a humanistic model, where it is really focused on the patient. And it is not, you do not have to have a previous diagnosis to access services. And my belief is that eventually it'll be covered by Medicare. I'm getting ahead of it a little bit, but generally as a society, when we see something consistently work, we decide to collectively embrace it. And our current model is to do that through taxpayer funded support. But right now, there'll be no insurance and it's all out of pocket. So that's where we are. We're on the, essentially people who are interested in these types of new modalities of healing and working with these compounds and medicines that we know people have been using for at least 6,000 years in different communities, bringing them back into society through our existing healthcare frameworks. And the research is in, whether it's the Imperial College of London or the world's leading research university, Johns Hopkins. There's federally funded, university-led research year after year, and just taking off right now, showing that it's not just more effective for psilocybin sessions where you consume psilocybin with a trained professional in a contained environment, where you have preparatory work, where you set your intentions, they make sure that you have an integration community afterwards, whether that's a therapist or your family or friends, that you can talk through what you experienced. They're showing over and over, it's not just more effective than Prozac for depression, It's not just more effective than the leading market treatment for smoking cessation. It's not more effective than just the leading practice to reduce recidivism when folks get out of prison. It is many times, not 10%, not 20%, which by itself would be really effective. It's several times, 2, 3, 4 times more effective than the leading treatment for some of these ailments that are very common right now in the world, and maybe always were. I'm not really sure. So that's where we are. That's what Oregon catalyzed, and we're on the precipice of creating the whole licensing framework. We have government licensed producer of these mushrooms, which you can find right now out in Forest Park. But government wants to be involved, so you'll have government licensed producers, government licensed testing laboratories that test them in a much more stringent fashion than anything else we put in our bodies, so you can feel safe about it. Government licensed practitioners, that's what Tom and I are mostly working on right now. And then government licensed service centers where you can go in and you can figure out if it's the right fit. And this is very serious business. This is talking about the most potentially painful or intimate parts of your life that maybe you've only ever shared with your partner, and figuring out, is there work to do here? Do I have unprocessed trauma? Is this the reason why I abuse alcohol? Is this the reason why I've been recently diagnosed with adult ADHD or disordered eating? You're sharing these things with an intention of getting to the nut, the subconscious of why we have the behaviors and habits that we have. So it is really nothing like cannabis, other than these things happen to be made illegal around the same time. And you're not taking it home, and you're working with trained professionals. One more note, and then I'll open up to questions. Generally, the way that this works, and I was just talking with President Bob about this, is, and this is what happened to me coming out of City Hall and the mayor's office, really having developed some bad behaviors. I mean, I think I can say, frankly, working in a place like City Hall, it can be so punishing that you don't even know that you're punishing yourself. And I began to punish myself by, it wasn't terrible, but I was resetting in the easiest, cheapest ways possible from very hard days, months, and years with alcohol and with overeating and with antisocial tendencies of wanting to just not see friends. Only later on did I hear from my partner. We're now together for 9 years, I'm married, about to start having kids. She's like, you were so different than the person that I first met. And I didn't even feel comfortable telling you, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could endure this, how different you were, and there's no end in sight. And I had she felt confident I would never be gone from the mayor's office. I would do that forever. And I would continue to work with our very popular mayor, Ted Wheeler, for a second term. And that was her life. Things went a different direction. I had that single evening in a controlled set and setting. That's the two words, set and setting. Mindset. What is your mindset? And what is the physical setting? Which are the most important things for this experience. With the right set and setting, a single evening put me back into myself. I got back into alignment. The next day, I felt more joyful. I was open to some of the wisdom that Leslie, my now wife, and my parents had shared with me, and I felt like things had color again. I had kind of a new lease on life. And I know it's like City Hall did that to you. It sounds like maybe you like served in the war or something, but it was, everyone's experiences, no matter where you are, can create what we call trauma, which is a word that's now in vogue, but it generally just means you were presented with something so difficult that you had to endure, that in your subconscious somewhere you developed a tool to endure it. And whether that's becoming numb or becoming angry or whatever it is, that is where I was. And so what happened when I had that single evening with Bill Withers in the background, feeling the cold through the window, where I had this experience I'd never had before? Well, generally speaking, this is what the federally funded university-led research consistently shows, is whether it's a PET scan or an EKG or a CAT scan, what they're showing is, here's your brain with a significant amount of psilocybin, in your body, and here's your brain without. And with a significant amount, which can mean a couple grams of the actual mushroom up to many grams, and eventually we'll start to extract this so you're not having to consume raw mushrooms, which is just not the most, psilocybin mushrooms do not taste great, at least to me. So eventually they'll be in a pill derived from the naturally grown fungi out of the ground at Forest Park, or its government test, licensed laboratory, which is what we're on track for. What happens is it changes the way that electricity is running through your brain. So our brains are just these really advanced pockets of meat, essentially. And our thoughts and our personality and our brains are just the way that electricity runs through it. Different parts of our brain operate different ways. The most recent part of our brain that developed really rapidly some time ago is called the prefrontal cortex, the new cortex. That's responsible for storytelling. And our ego and our personalities is simply a collection of stories that we tell ourselves, that other people have told us, that society have told us, that we told ourselves. And in our subconscious, where we can't usually access, and most of the time, most people will never access their subconscious because it is subconscious, that's where the core of our personalities live, often created in childhood. And because of that, that's where the sources of our joy, of our optimism, of our cynicism, of our anger, of our substance abuse, that's also where it lives. And so the CAT scans or the EKGs show that that part of the brain, the electricity is offline or largely offline. There's way less activity in the default mode network of our prefrontal cortex, which is where our egos live and our subconscious lives. And the rest of the brain is lighting up. I mean, it's really fun. It's like a fireworks show. It's just taken off. So what's happening there? Well, in that moment, which can be 2 to 8 hours, and people don't abuse these things. They're not addictive. Then they're not abused because this is a really intense experience and often really painful, because for the first time, people will be seeing the roots of their behavior, the roots of their suffering. They'll be confronting things that are so painful that they haven't thought about since they were a kid. If they were abused by family or friends, and I won't get graphic, but things that were so painful that we actually repressed, and those things come back to light. And if we don't process that stuff and forgive those people and work on that, the coping mechanisms can look like things later in life, like detachment or antisocial behavior or alcohol abuse. And so generally speaking, when your subconscious goes offline, there's no protection. You're seeing who you are. You're seeing your behaviors. You're seeing how you're hurting yourself or hurting others. And it's very harrowing. It's a very intense experience, especially if you've done something like been enlisted into a war and been charged with killing people you did not know or being part of that. It's very intense if you had complex trauma, which a lot of veterans have. And the rest of the brain is lit up, parts that are responsible for creativity and for empathy. And what happens afterwards is like, what just happened? What just happened? And that's why we need a medical model with trained professionals that's still accessible to everybody, but is in a safe container. And that's what Tom and Sheree have created. And as of yesterday, Colorado's approved. So now Colorado is adopting the same model. We will have all states eventually have this through a federal program. I'm just convinced of it. And so then the next step is, how do you integrate these insights? How do you work with these revelations? And that's where the real big work happens. And that's called integration. And so it's essentially like, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, 25 years in one night. And it's not that helpful for me to say that, because you don't want to build up expectations beyond what some people can experience. But a lot of people have that. Like, wow, I've been doing therapy for 35 years, and that night broke it all open. Not for everybody, but often. So that's what we're doing. Help Tom and Sheree create the ballot measure. We've now created a school, first government licensed school to train these people in the world. We're also creating a foundation in Sheree's honor to offer scholarships for both services and for people to get trained in the absence of insurance existing. And our school is the most affordable school in the state at this point. It's $7,900 to get trained, so it's not expensive or not cheap. So that's what we're doing right now. And the services will come online sometime in summer 2023 is when you yourself or your friends can begin to think, is this right for me? Do I have a need, or do I have a family or friend in need? That's me. That's what we're doing. Thanks for listening. Was that too long?
No, that's fine. Great.
Ron.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nate, I have two questions. First, is this a one-time cure-all? Is it a series of sessions you have with a trained professional? Is it something you take home and you use when you're feeling that bad load coming on. Second question is, the state just denied another product that was on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know the difference or what that was.
Yeah.
Those are my questions.
We'll take the second one first. I'm not aware of any statewide measure. Did you talk about the election yesterday?
Yes.
Or was that yesterday, 2 days ago? There was a bunch of counties that decided to opt out of psilocybin services, of this new form of healthcare. Is that what you're thinking of, or is there a
maybe? Can anyone else help me here?
Yeah, who's got Ron's back?
There were a number of counties opt out. Yeah, before it's a lot like a number of cities who opted out of having marijuana shops in there, and it's that's the process. And I haven't checked to see if the results of any of that, but there were a number of counties that were, did not want to have psilocybin treaters in their community.
Yeah, it's a kind of a funny part of, like, to make policy. It's not the most effective way to make a policy by doing a bunch of polling and figuring out what do we need to do to get 50% of the vote plus one. It's a pretty bad recipe for policy creation, but that's what we have through the initiative petition process, which Oregon actually created to help counter unresponsive state legislatures. And so what we did in Measure 91, which legalized cannabis, and what we did when we wrote about Measure 109 was include a provision to help essentially protect against any internal opposition from the Sheriff's Association or the Association of Oregon Counties to say, hey, if this thing passes, your county you can, as county commissioners and counties, decide to opt out as well. So voters passed this in 2020. Some counties did not pass this. And generally speaking, the counties that said, this isn't for us yet. I don't know about this. I don't know about this whole drug thing. It's how some people may respond to it. And so they have the ability to put it on the ballot, to refer it to the ballot and opt out. And most of the counties where the ballot measure did not pass, they opted out. In 2 notable counties where it was on the ballot, they passed it. That's Jackson County and Deschutes County. So Jackson County is like where Medford is, and Deschutes County is where Bend and those cities are. So the 2 big counties where we know a lot of these businesses want to exist to kind of offer this type of healing to the people in that area, they opted in. But all the counties that said, nah, I don't know about it in 2020, they generally opted out. Your first question, it's the thing where you get so excited about something and you become an evangelist, and then that actually doesn't serve your cause, and it weirds people out, and they're like, I don't know, this dude sounds like he's got snake oil for sale. I'm trying to stop, from doing that myself. And so one way I'll do that is by saying it's not a cure-all. This does not work for everybody, just like Prozac does not work for everybody to treat just depression, and just like traditional therapy doesn't work for everybody who have PTSD and decide, are thinking maybe it's better not to be around anymore. So not a cure-all, but the success rates are staggering. And for some people, and I would venture to say it's probably not for most people, but maybe they just want to do one and done because it can be such an intense experience. For some people, it's one single session. At Johns Hopkins University, where the main research in the world is happening right now, they do multiple preparatory sessions. They only work with people who have essentially anxiety because they're in the last 6 months of their life, so end of life anxiety, and they want to just experience the last moment of their life in a more joyful way, or they have treatment-resistant depression or PTSD, and haven't recently, but in the past have felt like the best option was to call it quits and not be around anymore. Those are the people they accept. So the people who have the most gnarly conditions, they don't accept them if they or their family or their grandparents have any contraindications, which means any history of schizophrenia or psychosis, which is the only known thing at this point that it can occasion. If you have a history of essentially becoming so untethered, just out there, this can occasion more of that, and so they'll screen them out. You're not being accessed, but they'll go through this very intense screening process. Then you'll have your big journey, your big session, and then you'll have multiple integration sessions. For some people, that is what's needed, and for some people, especially if they have a very clear intention. I know that I abuse alcohol. I know that I don't treat people the way I want to. I know that I'm mean to myself, and it doesn't work from that single session. Then they'll have a cadence, maybe every year, every 2 years, every 6 months. So it really runs the gamut. But there's nothing else quite like this this class of plants and medicines that we call psychedelics, which has got cultural baggage. So now we're calling entheogens, but I don't use the term entheogen yet because nobody knows what that means. It's entheogen is the new term that we're using. So it used to be a different name, and they're like, oh, they got cultural baggage. And so a bunch of people got together and said, let's call them psychedelics. And then I got caught up with making people protest the Vietnam War. And so now that has baggage. And so now we're giving a new name to it. But anyways, there's no class of compounds that we know of that can have that kind of impact after a single treatment. But for a lot of people, require more sessions.
Do you recall that Michael Pollan wrote a book about psilocybin use?
Yeah, How to Change Your Mind is like the gateway for a lot of people. How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. Oh, what was your name, sir?
Ron.
Ron was asking about Michael Pollan's book. How to Change Your Mind is written by Michael Pollan, who's a very well-known, before this, author of Gardens and Gardening and a researcher at UC Berkeley. And he wrote a really beautiful, compelling book that was also very helpful for me called How to Change Your Mind, which is a catalog of the history of this class of compounds in plants and fungi and the latest research and how it got intertwined with politics and horse trading and where we're at now. And it really accelerated this whole movement.
I had a couple of questions. Having grown up in the Bay Area, is this the same as LSD? Is this just another name for that kind of a drug? Number one.
Yeah.
And I would think that, with all of the treatment, for depression and so on, the common medications like Zoloft and Prozac and bupropion and so on, is there maybe a pushback from this generation of practitioners that, and maybe for the AMA, that have always treated these types of conditions in a certain sort of a way that those practitioners need to kind of go away, so that there's this new generation of maybe practitioners who perhaps are maybe a little bit more open-minded to consider this kind of treatment?
Yeah, great questions. Answer the second one first. Yes, there's pushback. Awesomely, the American Medical Association kind of gets it. It turns out if you do 60 years of research at the best research universities in the world, at some point, maybe after 60 years, people are like, oh, okay, I'm starting to feel what you're putting out there. And so AMA and a lot of institutions are excited. Some practitioners who just who say no, and that's okay. Nothing should be forced on anyone. And there are a lot of practitioners who never were skeptics who are now on board. We have 102 students in our training program right now, and a lot of them are doctors. We've got some researchers from OHSU. We've got college and high school. We've got one high school guidance counselor and a college curriculum advisor. So we have this broad swath of people who are coming in, and some of them were skeptics, and we're like, I'm not quite sure about this yet. But there is some opposition, especially because you just simply can make a lot more money around a business where someone is consuming your product twice a day or twice a week than something that you maybe only have to have once. And so they're just from a business standpoint, and I feel for people. Some people have spent billions of dollars supporting an FDA trial to get some of the medications that we have, and we should thank them. That's a service. Sometimes people can kind of get out of whack, and profit can be the incentive, but in my experience, that's typically not the case, even with big pharma, where it's now fashionable to kind of ridicule them. Those people are still trying to be of service and help people. And it's very challenging if you think, well, I just spent $2 billion in 25 years getting something past the FDA, and now this new alternative that Oregonians just passed is more effective, and they didn't have to spend 25 years and billions of bucks. So there are people who are upset. But you know what? Sorry, we're going to help people.
Sandy, I think that's the last question.
It's not LSD. LSD is a synthetic compound created by Albert Hofmann, and back in Germany, kind of celebrated in this space. And that's a synthetic compound. And generally speaking, it has the same impact on our default mode network and our prefrontal cortex that these other medicines have, and it can be deeply healing. And frankly, if LSD pulled better in Oregon than psilocybin mushrooms, this whole bout measure would have been structured around that. If there was a certain type of apple that had this healing and it pulled better, that's how this whole bout measure would have been structured around. So that's kind of an insight into the policy making.
I just want to know, what is the efficacy comparing this to like other traditional things like EMDR for trauma? It's like a rapid eye movement for people. And then what do you anticipate the cost will be once all the training and those kind of things get set up? What would be the cost? And it doesn't surprise me. You said 60 years this has been in the making?
Yeah, consistent research for about 60 years.
Yeah,
on and off.
Well, it's kind of like how long it took the medical people to finally convince people that there was a benefit to medical marijuana as well too. So I mean, that doesn't surprise me.
Sure.
So
yeah. And it can, and medical marijuana and the cannabis can also be abused. So it's things are nuanced. Yeah. So EMDR, I think so I've done EMDR, and it's essentially, you can put yourself into it. The general science of EMDR is kind of basic. When we walk, it's essentially a form of EMDR. And I've been walking for a couple million years. So it turns out like we can be more focused, our brains kind of work better. It actually opens up different neural pathways in our brains. Drumming circles can get you into that same kind of state, what people call flow state. And so EMDR is rapid eye movement, or you can do it by tapping yourself like this. And it can essentially bring you, it's like a cheat to get into a meditative state. And it can bring you to a place where you're more, your body essentially has reached into a more homeostasis is kind of one way to think about it. So you get into kind of a rhythm, you're feeling good, and you're more able to revisit traumatic parts of your life or things that you avoid or habits that don't quite serve you, don't help you, but you haven't changed it. So EMDR and that kind of process is going to be super helpful for millions of people after an experience and before an experience with psilocybin or with LSD, if eventually that becomes something that the government is licensing people to consume in a rigorous way, which I think is just an eventuality. And so it's not necessarily like an either or, but I would say someone who's wanting to work on these things, wanting to work on themselves, should consider all of it. And it may be somebody may be so kind of distorted and have been through so much hardship that it's not wise to begin with an experience this big, a psilocybin session. And it is wise to begin with an EMDR to kind of figure out, okay, what is going on within me? What are some things that I kind of don't, I kind of push away? It's the stuff that we push away that we need to engage with most, because that's the stuff that lives in our subconscious and drives our behaviors that we don't realize. So, but speaking personally, if someone's like, should I do 5 years of EMDR or should I consider working with a psilocybin facilitator? With the proper screening, I would probably say try psilocybin first and then see if EMDR can be kind of something to help integrate and prepare. Your other question? Cost. Oh, the biggie. Eventually, nothing. I mean, I'm just totally convinced this will be covered by insurance probably in the next 10 to 20 years, maybe 5 to 20 years, depending on elections. But to start, it'll really run the gamut. And we're working with some people who are going to be running a service center. They've already raised about close to $600,000. And they want to offer at the very beginning a sliding scale. You come in, if you've got means, you can pay for a service. And if you don't have means, you can get it for free. If I just want the minimum that the state requires, which is one preparatory session, the session itself, if somebody drives me to the service center, it can be outside, it can be inside, it can be in Clackamas, it can be in downtown Portland, wherever. And then afterwards, legally, we have to offer somebody a single preparatory session, but if they have a good support network and they don't want to pay for that time, then they can do it themselves. If somebody does just the bare minimum and they're working with a practitioner, and this is all not mandated by the government, it could be $500. It could be $250. It could be $5,000. If you want something that's 5 days long, that's more intense, I assume there'll be services down to $0 up to $20,000, depending on what people want. If they want this big multi-day, multi-week experience, but it's going to be tricky, and it's just not going to be accessible to everybody out of the gate. And so, one answer to that, the eventual answer, is to have it be covered by insurance, because insurance covers things that works, and we know this works. And Oregon will be the main hub of research at scale in the world for this kind of stuff now that we passed this, which will only accelerate insurance covering it. But one thing we're doing in the meantime is we just had a really nice call. One of the reasons why, I guess I wasn't late. I was afraid of being late, but we had this really nice call with David Bronner, who runs Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps, who's just a groovy dude and a big philanthropist. And he gave us many millions of dollars to pass the campaign, and is now continuing to invest several $1 million in the infrastructure, training programs, service centers. We're working together to create a fund specifically to help cover people's services in the absence of insurance. That's called the Sheree Eckert Foundation. So my friend Tom's wife suddenly passed away 2 weeks after we passed the ballot measure. It's very upsetting, as you can imagine. And we have regrouped and tried to make meaning out of that loss and out of Sheree's vision. And somebody at the IRS, in the basement of the IRS, knows this works, because we did not think that our 501c3 exemption nonprofit application was going to be approved. We got approved in 2 weeks. They told us the wait time was 1 year. And so we now have a tax exempt nonprofit, and we've raised several $100,000, and we're going to have a fund specifically to help cover people's services who can't afford it. And it'll likely be people who are low income and with complex trauma, PTSD, et cetera. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Is that done? One more. This is fun. Sorry, I'm a talker.
Okay, just a question about the product.
Yeah.
Do you think it's going to be regulated by OLCC?
Oh, God, I hope not. No, that was one of the first things that we said. I mean, I love the OLCC. I work with them closely on other stuff, but no, it'll be all the supply chain will be probably tracked by the same for-profit tracking company called Metric that we use for adult use cannabis. So there'll be a clear supply chain, but it'll be regulated by the Oregon Health Authority. And so all of our programming lives within the Oregon Health Authority, except for our school, which is licensed by the Oregon Department of Education, and then all of the product, all the mushrooms and psilocybin, will be tested by ORLAB, which is a federal accredited testing company that, they test these products that we're putting in our body to the tune of 100 times more than lettuce or sandwiches or whatever is tested. So extremely safe.
One quick question.
I'll try to answer in one sentence.
Does it have any effect on insomnia?
I don't think I've seen any research, but I will say insomnia often is tied to a bunch of other stuff going on. And I bet the bunch of other stuff that's going on, there probably is research to show that the psilocybin therapy, psilocybin services can address some of that stuff. So I'd venture to say that there could be help, but it would probably be it's not like taking a pill, whoop, my insomnia is gone, I don't think. But yeah, if there's research that comes out, I love doing this. I'll try to find Bob's info through Tom, and I'll send it over for you. Help you sleep a little.
Thank you.